Hello, everybody, and welcome to our new criminology course. And we are going to start off by talking a little bit about crime and how theories are measured and what makes a good theory and a bad theory, etc., etc. But this is kind of the mindset I want you going into in every section of this course. Okay? All models are wrong, but some are useful. So all of the different theories of crime we're going to talk about throughout this entire course are wrong. None of them are perfect, right? There's going to be something that is inaccurate or described the wrong way or conceptualized the wrong way. But that doesn't mean they're not useful, okay? So, first off, what do we mean when we say a theory in criminology, right? Well, criminology is a science. It's a social science, but that is a type of science, and we're going to use the scientific method, right? If you want to learn more about the scientific method, go take a look at my research methods course. But in short, the scientific method is a series of observations and measurements, and it's a process by which we can explain some observed thing, right? So whereas in kind of regular everyday English, we might use the term theory to mean an idea or a guess, in science, the word theory means an explanation that is backed up by evidence, right? So every theory we're going to talk about in this course has been through this scientific process. There's been research conducted about it. And there is at least some level of scientific evidence to show that that theory is an adequate or useful explanation for our observations of crime, right? So when I use the term theory in this class, I don't mean guess, I don't mean idea, I mean explanation that has been backed up by evidence. Some theories have more evidence than others, but all the theories we're going to talk about in this class have some kind of evidence, some kind of data being used to kind of back it up, all right? Now, we also need to talk about crime, right? Because this course is all about why do people commit crime? Trying to answer that seemingly very simple question. But first off, what do we mean by crime, right? Crime is a construct created by a society. And there are some universal aspects or actions in all societies throughout human history that have been seen as crimes. But then there are others that are kind of society specific or time specific. So what do we mean by crime? There's violent crime, there's property crime, there's victimless crimes, there's drug use and prostitution and murder and sexual assault and robbery and theft and shoplifting and everything from parking tickets to not paying your taxes to all these different things. And all of those different crimes probably, almost undoubtedly, have different causes and different correlates and different kinds of people who are going to commit them. So is it even possible for us to give a definition of crime that is useful and good, and also should all that crime be lumped together into one crime umbrella that we're trying to investigate and discuss and theorize about, right? Now, for one thing, we need to distinguish between deviance and crime. Okay, crime is something that is prescribed by law. Proscribed, not prescribed. Proscribed by law, right? So everything from parking tickets up to murder, there are specific legal consequences, at least here in the United States, for doing that. Those are crimes. Deviance is actions that society has views negatively but are not necessarily illegal, right? So things like cheating on your spouse is deviant. Society views it as negative or bad, but it is not a crime. There is no legal punishment for it, right? So, should theories of crime define or attempt to predict crime, or should they attempt to predict deviance, right? Now, even within crimes, there's lots of different ways to categorize crime. The traditional way, the historic way, is splitting crimes up into mala prohibita and mala in se. And these are ancient Latin terms essentially translating to evil because we prohibit it and evil in itself, right? And this has evolved in modern common law tradition to be the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony, right? So misdemeanors or mala prohibita are crimes because we say they are. They're the minor things. They're the regulatory things like parking tickets. Whereas felonies or mala in se crimes are those that are kind of evil in themselves. Murder, sexual assault, robbery. The things that are either universal or nearly universal throughout all cultures and all times as that is wrong, that is not allowed. Whether it's a modern legal system or an ancient tribal system or whatever. Almost all cultures throughout all times throughout the world have prohibited those in some way or another, right? Now, we're going to have a bunch of different theories in this course that say crime is a result of this thing or that thing, or the process of becoming a criminal looks like this or like that. And we need to classify those theories into different kinds of theories, right? And there's lots of different ways to do that. One of those is to look at either whether a theory predicts the actions of individuals or attempts to explain the actions of individuals. Those are called micro-theories. Alternatively, we can have theories that attempt to explain why we see more or less crime in groups, right? So maybe it's different countries. We're going to explain why some countries have more or less crime than others. Those are macro theories. So if you're talking about why any individual becomes a criminal or not, that is a micro theory. If you're trying to explain why any group, whether it's a country or a state or a culture, has more or less crime than other countries or states or cultures or whatever, that is a macro theory. Okay? Now, we also have differences. There are also differences in theories about assumptions about human nature, right? Are humans inherently good and they need some external something to happen to turn them into criminals? Or are humans by nature evil and they need something external to control them and prevent them from acting on those kind of evil criminal impulses, right? Now keep in mind, these different theories and their predictions and assumptions about human nature are different than values, right? So we may be predicting crime, but that's not necessarily the same as saying those actions should be criminal, right? So if we go into a repressive country that doesn't allow political protesting, we might want to develop a theory to predict whether somebody will become a political protester, which is a crime in that country. That doesn't necessarily mean we're judging the kinds of people who would go out and protest at a political rally, because these theories are not based on our values. They're merely reflections of the values that have been enshrined into law, whether we agree with those or not, right? So don't think that one way to classify theories is by kind of reflects my personal beliefs about what should be criminal and what shouldn't. That is not a way to classify theory. And then one other kind of question you have to ask yourself when attempting to classify theories is what kind of crime do they explain? There are some theories that are meant to be very broad and explain lots of different kinds of crime and different kinds of deviance. There are other theories that are very specific to only certain types of crime or certain types of criminal or certain areas or kind of criminal types rather than all different kinds of crime, right? So there are lots of different kind of ways to look at these different theories and say, well, oh, this is a micro theory that assumes humans are inherently good and need some external force to push them into doing evil, but it only really explains violent crime. Versus this is a macro theory of crime that assumes humans are inherently evil and some societies do a better job of restraining them than others, right? But as we go through each theory, it will kind of help you to think back to this slide, to think back to these different kinds of classification systems for these different kinds of theories, okay? Now, how do we rank theories? What makes a good theory or a bad theory, right? So, there are lots of different things we can use to kind of grade a theory, where if we have, if they're equal on all but one of these, if we have two competing theories and they are otherwise equal, which one is kind of better? Which one should we continue to use or investigate or use as a model, right? So, one thing we need to look at is the simplicity of the theory, right? Does it take a page to describe the basic part of the theory or 50 pages, right? Can it be expressed in a few sentences and it's easy to understand even if you're 10 years old? Or is it incredibly complex with tons of different variables and moving parts and, conditional statements and all that stuff? All other things being equal, the more simple is preferred, okay? Second thing we need to look at is the scope of the explanation. What types of crime does it explain? Does it only explain this small subset of all crimes? Or does it explain all different kinds of crimes? What about deviance? Does it explain both crime and deviance? Or does it only explain crime? So again, all other things being equal, we would prefer a theory that explains more different types of crime, that also explains different deviant behaviors that aren't necessarily criminal, right? Another one we got to look at is logical consistency. Is it logically consistent within itself? Or does it say, have different pieces, some of which are kind of contradictory to others? So if part of your theory relies on human beings being inherently good and needing some external force to push them to becoming criminals, but then another part of your theory is clearly kind of assuming that people are inherently evil and need some outside force to control them, that's not really logically consistent, is it? Right? So all other things being equal, it is much, much, much better to have a logically consistent theory than a logically inconsistent theory. Is it testable? In other words, can we prove it wrong? Because science isn't about proving anything as true. Science has never proven anything right. Science is all about proving things wrong. The entire scientific process is based around somebody having an idea and then every other scientist trying to prove that person wrong, trying to prove that that idea does not reflect what happens in the real world. And if they fail to do that, then we start kind of believing that idea or that theory or that kind of thing that that initial scientist proposed, right? So if it's impossible to prove wrong, there's not really a good theory, is it? Right? Part of that is we have to be on the lookout for tautologies. Tautologies are where you're measuring the cause and the effect in the same terms. Right? So if part of your definition of what causes crime is the person being a criminal, well, that's circular reasoning. Right? If you're measuring your independent variable, your cause, by saying they're a criminal, and then your dependent variable is them committing crime, that's circular. Of course you're going to find a huge correlation between being a criminal and then committing crimes. Right? That's what's called a tautology. And there's a disturbing amount of those historically in criminal justice and attempting to kind of investigate and measure these different crim theories. Now, probably the most important factor of a good theory is empirical validity. In other words, what evidence does it have to support it? All other things being equal, between two theories, the one that has more evidence, more peer-reviewed, published, scientific examinations of its kind of ideas and predictions, the better it is. So the more empirical validity, the more evidence we have to support that theory, the better. And then finally, there's policy implications. If we are to believe this theory, and we take that as kind of the truth when it comes to why people commit crime, what are the policy implications? What can the government or societies or cultures or neighborhoods do to prevent crime based on that theory? So again, all other things being equal, we want policy implications that are kind of easier, cheaper, and more morally and ethically consistent with our values than not, right? So there's lots of different ways to kind of grade theories, and some of these are going to be more important or more commonly applied or more kind of effective in distinguishing whether something is a good theory or a bad theory than others, right? But keep these in mind as we're going through all of the theories we're going to talk about in this course. Now, we're going to talk a lot about causality in this course. We're going to say that this thing causes this other thing. And there's lots of different ways to think about what does that really mean? What does it mean for X to cause Y? What does it mean for this thing to cause someone to become a criminal, right? Well, first off, we have to talk about causality in such a way that we understand that there are 4 requirements for causality in a scientific kind of mindset, right? In normal everyday life, we use the word cause much differently. Like, right? In normal life, we say like, you know, I dropped the plate and that caused it to break. And that caused my spouse to get mad at me. In science, causality is usually thought of in kind of a different way, where causality means as we change this variable, this other variable changes alongside of it. Because this variable, whatever it is, causes an increase or a decrease in this other variable, right? And to establish that kind of causality, there are 4 things we need. Number 1, correlation. If one variable is changed, the other variable has to change with it. Sometimes that's a positive correlation where we increase one and the other increases. Sometimes that's a negative correlation where we increase one and the other decreases. But we need some kind of correlation. If we change one and the other just either doesn't move at all or does something random depending on how many times or what how we're changing X, the input, the cause, then there is no correlation and thus no causation, right? But correlation isn't enough. There's a common phrase in science that says correlation is not causation. It is required for causation, but it's not enough to show causation. So we need three other things. We need correlation. We need time order. In other words, the cause has to come before the effect in time. We haven't created a time machine yet, although if you're watching this video too far in the future, maybe we have. But as of time of recording, we have not created a time machine, and thus the cause has to come before the effect in time. Third thing we got to look at is non-spuriousness. And that's a really big fancy way for saying we have to make sure there's not some third variable that is affecting both our cause and our effect. Right? We got to make sure there's not some other thing that is changing both our cause and our effect that makes it look like the two are causing each other, but in reality it's this third thing that we're not measuring or didn't take into account, right? And then finally, the fourth requirement is theory. We have to have some idea why. We have to have some kind of explanation for why these two things are linked. Why changes in the cause results in changes in the effect, right? Now, there's also different kinds of causes in other ways. So, for instance, there's necessary and there's sufficient. Necessary means we have to have the cause before we can have the effect, right? If I take a book and I drop it, it will fall to the earth, right? The cause there is gravity. It is necessary for us to be in a place with gravity for the book to fall in a downward direction, right? But gravity is also a sufficient cause. In other words, this is a tough one to explain. Okay. Necessary causes, if something is a necessary cause, that means it has to be there for the effect to happen. But just because it's there doesn't necessarily mean the effect will happen. In order for a shooting to happen, a person has to have a gun. That is a necessary cause for a shooting to happen. But it is not sufficient. In other words, there are times where somebody is going to have a gun and no shooting is going to occur. So having a gun in that case is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. If it was a sufficient condition, every time somebody had a gun, a shooting would occur. So every time I release the book, it's going to fall to the earth, because gravity is a sufficient condition for falling towards the center of mass of the earth, right? So with necessary, we have to have it, but just because we have it doesn't necessarily mean the outcome will happen. Sufficient means every time we have it, the effect will happen. There's a little bit of a roundabout way of explaining that, but I hope you understand it. And the last thing we're going to talk about with causality is probabilistic causality, right? So if we say there's some cause and some effect, we might be talking probabilistically, i.e., the odds of something may increase or decrease, right? So if some person exhibits X trait, if they're, a male and they grew up in this neighborhood versus some other neighborhood, and they dropped out of high school, their odds of becoming a criminal are increased. But that's not a guarantee, right? We're not saying that if you meet these factors, you will become a criminal. We're saying if a person meets these factors, their probability of becoming a criminal are increased. So a lot of times in social science, we can't talk about causes directly. We have very few sufficient causes. We have to talk about causality in a probabilistic fashion, where we're not saying if X happens, Y will happen. We're saying if X happens, Y has a greater chance of happening. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you so much for watching.